lo echsar binote sheyar betzeni al memenuchot yenaleni nafshi yeshovev yancheni v'magle tzedek yancheni v'magle tzedek leman shemo gam ki elech begitz al mavet lo hirara ki ata imadi shiftecha umishantecha hema yenachamuni taroch lefanai shulchan neged zorerai dishanta vashemen roshi kosi revaya ach tov v'chesed yirfuni kol yemei chayai v'shavti bevet Adonai leorech yamim. Adonai roi lo echzar. Adonai roi lo echzar.
The mysteries of life and death are beyond human understanding. We are perplexed and overwhelmed when pain and anguish befall those whom we love. Confronted by death, which has taken Howard Adelman from our midst, we feel our own frailty. Like delicate flowers, we flourish only for a day. Eternal God, Shepherd of Israel, guide us, your flock, with love and with compassion. If in our grief and desolation we might stray from you, do not abandon us, but draw us closer to you. Grant solace and comfort unto those who mourn this day. May their lives together help to sustain them and add to the blessing which is theirs in the memory of the life of their beloved. In the valley of the shadow of death and beside the still waters and in the green pastures, you, O God, are our guide. Be our strength and our shield, our stay and our comfort throughout all our days. The Jewish calendar is turned today to Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the month of Av, the saddest day on the entire Jewish calendar, the darkest day of the year. And that is because it is on this day that we commemorate the destruction of the first and second temples of Jerusalem, when our people were sent into exile, an exile that lasted 2 millennia. So this might be some strange kind of comfort to our mourners today, to know that you are not alone in your grief, but the entire Jewish people are gathered with you, bent with grief on this day. The psalmist reflected on a life of importance, a life of impact. He wrote, Adonai ma'on ata hayita lanu bedor vador, b'terem harim yuladu v'techolel eretz v'tevel, u'me'olam ad olam ata el. Tashev enosh ad daka v'tomer shuvu v'nei adam, ki 1000 shanim be'einecha, ki yom etmol ki ya'avor v'ashmu rav alayla. O God, you have been our refuge in every generation. Before the mountains came into being, before you brought forth the earth and the world from eternity to eternity, you are God. You return us to dust. You decree, return you mortals, for in your sight 1,000 years are as yesterday when it has passed as a watch in the night. You engulf us in sleep. We are like grass that renews itself. At daybreak it flourishes anew. At dusk it withers and dries. The span of our life is 80 years and 10, or given strength 80 years. But the best of those years have trouble and sorrow. They pass by all too speedily, and we are in darkness. Teach us, therefore. Teach us, O God, to number our days that we may attain a heart of wisdom. Turn to us, O God, show mercy to your servants. Satisfy us at daybreak with your steadfast love, that we may sing for joy all our days. Let your deeds be seen by your servants, your glory by their children and their children's children. May your favor, O God, be upon us. Uma'aseh yadenu konena aleinu, uma'aseh yadenu konenehu. Establish the work of our hands, O God. Establish the work of our hands, that it may long endure. And the psalmist reflected on what makes for a man who is contented when looking back over his long life. How does he know it is well lived? This is the answer. Ashrei ish yarei et Adonai b'mitzvotav chafetz me'od. Contented is the man who reveres the Eternal One, who delights in God-given opportunities for service. Gibor ba'aretz yihiyeh zar'o dor yesharim yivorach. His descendants shall be courageous on earth, an upright generation to be blessed. Hon va'osher beveito v'tzidkato omedet la'ad. True wealth and real riches are found in his home, for his righteousness endures forever. Zarach b'choshech or la'yesharim chanun v'rachum v'tzadik. A light shines in the darkness for the upright. He is gracious. He is compassionate. He pursues justice. Tov ish chonen umalveh. Yichalkel dvarav b'mishpat. A good man lends graciously and conducts his affairs with justice. Ki le'olam lo yimot, lezecher olam yihi tzadik. A person who lives in this way shall never be shaken, for the righteous are remembered forever. And now to share their own memories, to pay their own tributes, to extend their own honor. First we'll hear from Howard's children. They'll come forward now and stand together here. And Howard's daughter, Rabbi Rachel Adelman, will be the leading voice. You can gather around her here on the bima. And then David Adelman, Howard's nephew, will speak.
Dad, do you remember that surreal experience when the ghosts of many of your dead friends and relatives boarded a bus that was traveling from Barrie to Toronto? The only ghost that sat beside you was your brother Al. You tried to have a conversation with him, but he ignored you. With deep sorrow in our hearts, it is unexpectedly your turn to board that bus. Before you board, however, we have a few words to share with you. Rachel, I remember dancing with you in the cottage kitchen to Edith Piaf's Je ne regrette rien, as Shauna recalls, riding on his shoes. You were a surprisingly great dancer, though tone deaf, which never stopped you from singing in your gravelly bass, swing low, or zoom gully gully, lullabies that would put any cantankerous baby to sleep. In the water of the Back Bay, you played shark. We were your prey, swimming from you with squeals of terror. And though you could terrify us in play, we always knew you were we were totally safe. In the years after your health started failing, you repeatedly avowed that your most important contribution and greatest joy was as a father. And here's Shauna's voice. During Daniel's bris, Dad explained, to whom exactly I don't recall, that the underlying lesson of the circumcision tradition was to teach a child that he or she couldn't trust anyone, including a parent. And indeed, you were not able to trust your father. You told many stories of disappointment and small acts of betrayal in which your father repeatedly shirked responsibility. Yet you did not, for the most part, follow in your father's footsteps. You were a bedrock, the soft ground upon which we occasionally fell, and the rope ladder that dropped when we found ourselves in a hole. Rachel, I remember as a teenager, I was once babysitting, and the baby, who was about 4 or 5 months old, woke up crying. Unable to console her, I was distraught because I had a major exam in grade 12, European history. So I called Dad. You came over and sang the baby to sleep in your arms. We stayed up until 2 a.m. to review for the exam. I remember him regaling me with stories of Bismarck and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Of course, I aced the exam. You came to all of our performances and graduations and traveled to Israel when my first child, Ariella, was born, and to Perth, Australia, where Eitan was born. You subsequently visited me in Israel almost annually with short whirlwind trips. You showered us with gifts, cleaned out my refrigerator, and then filled it with groceries. We'd have long conversations at 5 a.m. When I became an observant Jew, eventually to become a scholar and rabbi, I felt nothing but deep respect and pride from you. You were an uber dad, a great patriarch in the best sense, who felt responsible for and cared for all the extended family, members who came under your wing. Your love was not drawn from a void, but from a deep wellspring of fresh, life-giving water.
These are Dad's words. These next ones.
Yeah, and these are Dad's words that Gabriel remembers. I prayed every day. I pray every day. This is my Father. I pray every day that God renews his creation, if there is a God, and if God is still working at his job. I pray that each day will be a brand new day, a day full of creativity, a day of renewal when the world is always experienced anew. I have never been concerned with whether God existed or not. The issue was never for me whether I believed or did not believe in God. The issue has always been whether I believe that if God existed, that I was worthy of his faith in me. This is Jeremy. Dad, I once tried to calculate the hours I spent in your study in 64 Wells Hill, especially sunk in that massive corduroy chair facing your leather desk, watching you work. So much wood, so many books, all those pads with your scrawled handwriting racing across the sheets, so much brown, all those long discussions and explanations, even diagrams of dialectics you penned for me with your infinite supply of Bics. Mostly, I watched or tried to keep myself busy while you wrote, pulled a book off the shelf, wrote some more. You gave me a world of ideas, Dad, but you also gave me a fondness for material. That room was just so material. I don't know how else to put it. The texture of the leather, the grain of oak, your soft skin when your big arms draped over the boy me. To be in that room was not just tactile, though. The material also had a smell, the smell of human warmth, seasoned by wood and paper and leather. I never wanted to leave that room. When I finally did, what I had to learn was to bring that room inside me, to make it mine, and thereby carry with me the sound, the smell, the fingertip feelings of what it is like to be with you. Eric. A smell, a look, a movement. Your voice is in my head. I can see the covers of the Dizzy Gillespie record in the sun-filled back overhang room. Your eyes gleaming at me with the joy of introducing jazz music to me. Curiosity took courage. I watched you unleash your curiosity with the world. Mine was a differently crafted curiosity, but your light has been my beacon. Sean. I tried walking in your shoes when I was younger. They were too big. I tried wearing extra socks. Your feet crowded me out. I learned to watch your feet. I learned to walk beside you. Eric. It's Eric. This is Eric. Let me say it again. Eric. I tried walking in your shoes when I was younger. They were too big. I tried wearing extra socks. Your feet crowded me out. I learned to watch your feet. I learned to walk beside you and feel your tempo. I'm going to walk on my own now. Will you let me? Shauna. Dad, when we were little, you wrote a children's novel featuring our cat, Turk, who had 9 lives. Little did I know that the cat would be an avatar for our father, a complex man who literally and figuratively lived and almost died and seized life again and again. You are bigger than life, loved us all fiercely and tenderly. We feel so blessed and broken. We will miss you deeply. Perhaps you will now have the opportunity to have that conversation with your brother, Al. Tauhtajana.
Nothing human was foreign to Howard. He was an incisive observer of humanity's greatest sources of conflict, but he never lost sight of the potential for peaceful coexistence and openness to difference. He saw the world from multiple perspectives, philosophical, pragmatic, religious, and he was unafraid of contradiction, whether in himself, other people, organizations, or governments. I imagine that for him, the world was too complex and endlessly interesting for it to be otherwise. And he was that rare academic who applied his deep knowledge and rigorous analytical mind to living problems that challenged even his prodigious skills in transcending bureaucracies and mobilizing people. Howard's academic work and activism on refugee resettlement and genocide were groundbreaking. As one close colleague observed, he never let theories stand in the way of facts. He earned the Order of Canada for his work with the Indo-Chinese boat people and Operation Lifeline, which he established out of his living room in 1979. His work and advocacy transformed the law in Canada and opened the country to generations of refugees seeking asylum. And drawing on this experience, Howard established the Center for Refugee Studies at York University. It is among the leading research centers globally on refugees and human rights. When the Rwandan genocide exploded in 1994, Howard was at the forefront of tackling this horrific event. His scholarship on the roots of ethnic conflict and clear-eyed vision for effective interventions made him an internationally recognized expert and a leading voice within the United Nations. This and other world events touched Howard deeply, compelling him to take action. His leadership and moral compass will greatly be missed by the many friends and colleagues he made throughout his life. Howard was a great bear of a man, physically and temperamentally. You knew he was in the room. His warmth and natural charisma drew you to him. But guileless children, beware his playful taunts and gleeful interrogations. He was always up to something. He could devastate you with a cutting swipe or a roar of anger poised high above you, but at heart, and increasingly over time, he was more curious than intimidating and more loving than fierce. And the solace of his strong hands and broad arms around you was a gift, showered on children, but given more sparingly, yet just as freely to adults when it really mattered. Howard's connections to his family and friends were grounded in places. His home on Wells Hill Avenue in the city where he had lived for more than 8 decades. His beloved Trimtree Island in Georgian Bay, which was a counterpoint to his otherwise busy life. They provided a place to reflect and occasionally to write, but most importantly, to share dinners, games of capture the flag, long swims, and countless conversations. Howard loved and cherished his family. He was a devoted brother to Al and Stan, and a deeply caring son to Frances. Howard's first marriage ended in 1981. First marriage to Margaret ended in 1981, but she remained a dear friend and a treasured mother to his first 4 children. His children, Jeremy, Shauna, Rachel, Eric, Daniel, and Gabriel, as well as his 11 grandchildren and 5 Israeli great-grandchildren, commanded his deep love and abiding attention. He both set high standards and understood that each of his children must have the freedom and support to pursue their own interests. While this knowledge did not stop him from worrying, he took great pleasure in learning from them, and especially in arguing with them as they made their way in their life. He also felt great pride in all their accomplishments. Howard met Nancy in Loblaws. Though some have suggested this was no accident at all, and they were married at 64 Wells Hill in 1984. She brought a different light to his life and a mutual connection and love that ran deep. They were a team in many things, raising 2 children, a panoply of house projects, Israel Today, vacations abroad, and meandering road trips across the continent. Throughout all that they did and shared together, Trimtree Island was a sanctuary that united and sustained them. Nancy enriched Howard's life in myriad ways, and together they were deeply loving parents and a powerful partnership among their wide circle of friends. Nancy guided and supported Howard through the inevitable ups and downs of a life well lived, and these experiences deepened both their love and respect for each other. In a series of blog posts from June, Howard reflected on the nature of wisdom using the myth of Minerva and her great owl. He argued that owls may serve truth, but the route they take may be indirect and full of their own passions, rivalries, and jealousies. What ultimately allows the owl to serve truth and to beat back lies and illusions is not its penetrating vision or steady objectivity, but its acute hearing and capacity to listen. In his telling, wisdom is spectral and fleeting, like the owl that spreads its wings only with the coming of the dusk. Similar to life itself, these qualities do not diminish wisdom, but instead make it more precious when you glimpse it. Howard wrestled with his passions and rivalries. He lived fearlessly, with self-awareness and humor, and he was often a terrific listener. Howard lived life fully, he loved and thought deeply, and he was a source of light and hope to all of us. He will be missed intensely, but his memory will remain bright and close to our hearts.
In addition to the beautiful words of comfort and memory celebrating Howard's life, we often turn to sacred texts. Earlier we heard some of our liturgical selections from the book of Psalms, and now we will turn to the biblical narrative from the prophet Elijah, from specifically Felix Mendelssohn's oratorio, Elijah, as family friends will share a selection adding comfort through song. And so I'd like to call up Paula Arciniega, accompanied by Wayne Strongman at this time. Thank you.
All I can add to these loving tributes to round out the story of Howard's great love for his family and his professional pursuits is to say a word about the kind of Judaism that Howard Adelman embraced in his later years, and my admiration for the Jewish values that drove him throughout his lifetime. On this day of Tisha B'Av, the ancient rabbis ask, as we ask, why was Jerusalem's temple destroyed? Why were our ancestors turned into homeless wanderers for 2,000 years? As if writing a parallel report to Professor Adelman's well-researched studies on the topics of human suffering, our sages needed to know, what were the root causes of this human suffering? We can imagine those ancient rabbis gathered around a study table, and Howard would take his place among them to debate the possibilities. I'll share just a few that are named in the Talmud as a way of lifting up Howard's life commitments. There it is recorded that Rabbi Ula said Jerusalem was destroyed because people were not ashamed of one another, because people did not rebuke one another. Howard was not the kind of activist who shouted shaming accusations into a megaphone on a street corner, but he was ashamed of how the world seemed to tolerate the intolerable. His research allowed the facts to speak loudly for themselves. And then he took those facts and he amplified their volume further to bring about real change, lasting change, for this country and for the world. Bringing the facts of global refugee crises and global genocides to light as he did enabled countries to move from their shame, to rebuke one another's indifference to suffering, and to empower one another to change their policies. This impact is immeasurable. In anticipation of the 40th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, I received an email from two young representatives of the local Toronto Vietnamese community. They said, "Professor Adelman is our Moses, and we would like to honor his leadership." With Howard's blessing, we then got to planning a very special occasion here at Holy Blossom. It was a remarkable reunion. People who were decades before newcomers to Canada came with their children and their grandchildren to reunite with some of the Holy Blossom families who had supported them when they first arrived. And they came to shake the hand of the man who had created a pathway for them to find safe haven, to find a pathway by which they could create for themselves a future of dignity and purpose. Rabbi Abaye said Jerusalem was destroyed because people desecrated Shabbat. Later in life, Howard made himself what we call a Shabbat morning regular. He would take his place in the middle of the sanctuary, in the middle of the row, just right about there where his friend Peter is sitting. He seemed to prefer to sit alone. He would close his eyes and meditate on the beauty of the music. He would often be invited by the Gabbai to have an aliyah to the Torah or to carry the Torah, but Howard rarely accepted. For someone with so much to say, he was very quiet here in the sanctuary he loved. For someone of such physical stature, he seemed to delight in how small these vaulted ceilings made him feel. For someone with so much loving family and so many admiring friends, Howard seemed to find great company in the presence of fellow Jews and strangers who would gather here on Shabbat mornings. And for someone who filled every waking hour with work and productivity and creativity, Howard was very good at stopping and being still for Shabbat. Rav Yehuda said Jerusalem was destroyed because people neglected Torah study and disparaged Torah scholars. Most Shabbat mornings before the service, Howard would join us for an hour around the Torah study table. And during the pandemic, he would join us on the Zoom screen. Over the last few months, we would see his little Zoom square with giant trees of Vancouver Island behind him. It looked like the Garden of Eden. Now, Howard was not the only professor around that Torah study table, but he was the only one who brought insights from Aristotle and Kant. He was the only one who could tell us about the weight of an eagle. He was the only one who could speak with the authority of a scholar of refugee studies when it came time to give insight into how we humanize and dehumanize one another. You can imagine at first I was intimidated by Howard's participation at Shabbat morning Torah study. There were days I wished we could swap places and he could teach the class. I would have liked to have been his student for an hour. But he was always encouraging of me, and he chose his words carefully when he had a comment to make. And he trusted me week after week to bring the goods, to bring the finest texts and ideas from the Jewish library that he wanted to crack. I will miss my student. I will miss my teacher. It is also suggested that Jerusalem was destroyed because people refused to compromise. There were certain zealots among the people of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, and the sages said to them, "Let us go out and make peace with the Romans," but the zealots did not allow them to do this, did not allow them to compromise. Howard's lifelong friend and dear colleague David DeWitt writes that Howard's standards were high. He expected much of himself and also of others, especially those he trusted, and those who occupied roles that came with responsibilities and obligations. He did not avoid disagreements. Indeed, he recognized these as vital to intellectual growth and uncovering understanding, if not truth. And Howard also understood that seeking desired goals and outcomes, especially practical policies and practice, must require compromise. He acknowledged empirical evidence even when it contradicted theoretical expectations. And Howard rarely lost sight of the bigger picture, always trying to move towards a sense of fairness, justice, and rights, even when it required compromise. And finally, it has been suggested by the ancient rabbis that Jerusalem was destroyed because of baseless hatred. When the Jewish people are divided, we put ourselves at risk. When the Jewish people breaks into opposing factions and camps, we make ourselves vulnerable. Whenever baseless, senseless, unchecked hatred seeps in between the cracks that divide us, we are exposed. As skilled as Howard Adelman was in building a case and winning an argument, it was never infused with hatred, but only fueled by a great and determined love. One example of the bridges of understanding Howard built to strengthen and fortify the Jewish people was in what we call the Israel Dialogue series, which he created with a very special circle of friends. It sprang from their own deliberations about the future of the Jewish state. And when I asked if they would share their conversations with the congregation, let us just be a fly on the wall while you deliberate, they did not hesitate. And then it flourished into something even greater. Again, Professor David DeWitt writes, "Our last project together was the Israel Dialogue, Zoom-based series supported by Holy Blossom Temple. During the early days of COVID, Howard and I recognized the need to have some way of promoting serious discussion about increasingly critical issues concerning Israel and the Middle East. We needed to have others with whom to discuss, debate, and learn, individuals with differing areas of expertise. We reached out to our international network of scholars and diplomats and journalists, and indeed hundreds of people would tune in week after week for these Israel dialogues." Tisha B'Av calls into focus our growing fears about the cohesion of the Jewish people, our growing fears about the future of the Jewish state, which Howard loved. And so today is just the first of many days. Today is a moment of many moments to come when we will miss Howard's voice. We will miss his insight. We will miss his perspective. We will miss his good guidance. How will we find our way without him? His name was Chaim ben Herschel Ufega. He lived up to his namesake. Every day of his life, Chaim means life. He illuminated life with his brilliant and inquisitive mind. He embraced life, never blind to its beauties nor its horrors. He passionately protected and uplifted countless lives through his work. He created more life through his children and grandchildren. And now we pray that his soul will be brought into eternal life under God's protection. Please rise.
El male rachamim, shochen bomeromim, hametzei menucha nechona tachat kanfei hashchina. Im kedoshim uteorim kezohar harakia mazhirim et nishmat Chaim ben Herschel Ufega she'alach leolamo Began Eden Tehei menuchato Anabal Bal Harachamim Yastirehu beseter kenafav leolamim Veitzror bitzror achaim et nishmato Adonai hu nachalato ve'anuach Shalom al mishkavo v'nomar Amen.
Compassionate God, eternal Spirit of the universe, grant perfect rest in your sheltering presence to Howard Adelman, who has entered eternity. O God of mercy, let him find refuge in the shadow of your wings, and let his soul be bound up in the bond of life everlasting. God is his inheritance. May he rest in peace, and together we say, Amen.
Shalom.